Picture Napoleon Bonaparte in 1812, standing at the absolute pinnacle of his power. He controls most of continental Europe. His Grande Armée is the most powerful military force on Earth. He's defeated every major European power multiple times, and he's personally considered the greatest military genius since Alexander the Great. But here's what most people don't know. He's completely broke. Not personally broke. He's accumulated enormous personal wealth, but France, his empire, his entire system is drowning in debt, and this debt, more than Russian winters or British naval power or enemy coalitions, is what will ultimately destroy him. Because Napoleon's genius was military and administrative, he could win battles, reorganize governments, and create legal codes that last centuries. But he never understood finance. He never grasped the fundamental economic realities that constrain even the greatest empires, and his failure to solve or even really comprehend France's debt problem created a vicious spiral that forced him into increasingly desperate military adventures, which required more money, which created more debt, which required more conquest, until the whole system collapsed at Leipzig and Waterloo. And this isn't just a story about Napoleon. It's a story about how even genius-level ability in some domains can't compensate for blindness in others, about how debt dynamics can trap leaders in cycles they can't escape, and about how financial problems, if left unresolved, eventually become military and political catastrophes that no amount of tactical brilliance can overcome. Let's start at the beginning, because Napoleon didn't create France's debt problem, he inherited it. And understanding this is crucial to understanding why he could never solve it. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, was triggered partly by a fiscal crisis. The French monarchy under Louis XVI was essentially bankrupt, decades of expensive wars, particularly supporting the American Revolution, combined with an unfair tax system where nobles and clergy were largely exempt, had created enormous government debt. And when the king tried to reform the tax system to address this, he triggered the political crisis that led to revolution. So from day one, revolutionary France was dealing with massive inherited debt, a collapsed tax system, and economic chaos. And then the revolution made things worse. Much worse. They issued paper money called assignats, backed initially by confiscated church lands. But they printed far too many, causing hyperinflation that destroyed savings and disrupted the economy. They fought wars against multiple European coalitions simultaneously, which was incredibly expensive, and they experienced internal rebellions and civil conflicts that further damaged economic productivity. By the time Napoleon seized power in 1799, France was in terrible financial shape. Government debt was enormous. Tax collection was inefficient and corrupt. Inflation had destroyed trust in paper money, and the country was still fighting expensive wars on multiple fronts. And here's where Napoleon's strengths and weaknesses become crucial. Because he was brilliant at military organization and government administration, he restructured the tax system, creating more efficient and fair collection mechanisms. He established the Bank of France in 1800, which helped stabilize the currency and provide credit. He created the franc germinal, a new gold and silver-backed currency that restored monetary stability after the chaos of revolutionary paper money. And he reformed government administration, reducing corruption and improving efficiency. And these were genuine achievements. France under Napoleon was better governed and more efficiently organized than it had been in decades. But none of this solved the fundamental debt problem, because the debt was too large, and Napoleon's solution to everything was war. Here's how the debt spiral worked, and this is crucial to understanding Napoleon's entire career. France had enormous debts from the revolutionary period. Napoleon needed money to pay these debts, service the interest, and fund his government. But France's economy, while improving under his reforms, couldn't generate enough tax revenue to cover both debt service and military expenses. So Napoleon's solution was conquest. He would invade other countries, defeat their armies, impose massive war, indemnities, loot their treasuries, and use this wealth to fund France. And initially, this worked brilliantly. The Italian campaigns of 1796 to 97 brought enormous wealth back to France. The conquest of Egypt, though ultimately a military failure, still involved looting Egyptian treasures. The victories over Austria and Prussia in 1805 to 1806 resulted in massive indemnity payments. And the conquest of Spain promised access to Spanish gold and colonial wealth. So for years, Napoleon was essentially funding France through plunder. and this created a perverse incentive. The more money problems France had, the more Napoleon needed to conquer, and the more he conquered, the more enemies he created, and the more enemies he created, the more expensive warfare became, creating a spiral that could only end in collapse. Let's look at specific numbers, because they're staggering. The indemnity imposed on Prussia after the Battle of Jena in 1806 was 311 million francs, an absolutely crushing amount that took years for Prussia to pay. Austria was forced to pay similar amounts after multiple defeats. Italian states paid enormous sums. In the Continental System, Napoleon's attempt to economically isolate Britain was partly designed to redirect European trade through France in ways that would generate revenue. But here's the problem. These indemnities and this plunder, while enormous in absolute terms, were never enough to solve France's underlying debt problem. They covered immediate expenses, they funded the next campaign, they maintained the army, but they didn't retire the debt, they didn't create sustainable finances, they just postponed the crisis. And meanwhile, the debt kept growing because every new campaign, even successful ones, cost money. Soldiers needed pay, equipment needed replacement, fortifications needed building, and the vast empire Napoleon was creating required enormous administrative expenses to govern. The Continental System illustrates Napoleon's economic blindness perfectly. The idea was to close European ports to British trade, strangling Britain economically and forcing them to make peace. But Napoleon never seemed to understand the economic consequences for Europe and France. By cutting off British trade, he was also cutting off a major source of goods and revenue. Smuggling became rampant. European economies suffered, and resentment against French rule grew. The system required constant military enforcement, which was expensive, and it never actually worked because Britain found alternative markets and routes. Meanwhile, France lost access to colonial goods, prices rose, and industries that depended on British imports or exports struggled. So the Continental System, designed to solve Napoleon's British problem, actually made his financial problems worse, but he doubled down on it, becoming more aggressive in enforcing it, which required occupying more territory, which cost more money, which deepened the debt spiral. Now let's talk about the specific mechanisms of Napoleon's military finance. Because they're revealing, Napoleon paid his soldiers relatively well, which was important for maintaining morale and loyalty. But this was expensive, especially as his armies grew larger. He also implemented a system where conquered territories had to feed and supply French armies, the famous war feeds war principle. But this created huge problems because local populations were stripped of resources, causing famine, economic collapse, and hatred of French occupation, which led to guerrilla warfare and resistance movements, which required more French troops to suppress, which cost more money. See the spiral? Napoleon also extracted loans from conquered territories, though these were really forced tribute, and he installed relatives on thrones across Europe partly so they could funnel resources to France. His brother Joseph was made king of Spain, Louis was king of Holland, Jerome was king of Westphalia, and so on. But these satellite kingdoms often proved unreliable. They prioritized their own stability over French demands, and some, like Holland under Louis, actually refused to fully cooperate with Napoleon's economic policies. The Russian campaign of 1812 is where the debt spiral reached its inevitable catastrophe, because Napoleon invaded Russia for multiple reasons, but financial pressure was absolutely central. Russia had withdrawn from the Continental System, trading with Britain again, and this was unacceptable to Napoleon not just for strategic reasons, but for economic ones. If Russia could ignore the Continental System, others would too, and the whole structure of economic warfare against Britain would collapse. So Napoleon assembled the largest army in history, over 600,000 men from across his empire, and marched into Russia. But this campaign was phenomenally expensive. Assembling and supplying such a massive force required enormous expenditure, and the expectation was that victory would be quick and would result in Russian submission, indemnities, and renewed compliance with the Continental System. But instead, the Russians retreated, burned Moscow, and let winter destroy Napoleon's army. And of the 600,000 men who invaded, fewer than 100,000 returned in fighting condition. This was an absolute catastrophe, not just militarily but financially, because Napoleon had invested enormous resources in this campaign and gotten nothing back. no indemnities, no plunder, no political settlement, just complete loss. The aftermath of Russia shows how debt spirals accelerate, because Napoleon now faced a coalition of all major European powers: Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, Sweden, all aligned against him, and France was exhausted. The Russian disaster had destroyed the best units of the Grande Army. Manpower was depleted, and finances were in crisis, but Napoleon's response was to raise more armies, impose more taxes and conscription, and fight more battles, because what else could he do? If he made peace from a position of weakness, France would face crushing indemnities and loss of territory, which would make the debt problem even worse. So his only option was to fight, hoping to win enough victories to negotiate from strength. But this required money France didn't have. So Napoleon resorted to increasingly desperate measures. He debased the currency slightly. He imposed forced loans on wealthy citizens. He squeezed more from satellite states, and he postponed payments to government creditors and suppliers, creating resentment and economic disruption. The campaign of 1813 in Germany was Napoleon's attempt to reverse his fortunes, and for a while it looked like it might work. He won several battles against the coalition forces, but he couldn't win decisively enough to force peace, partly because he lacked the cavalry and resources to pursue defeated enemies. Casualties from the Russian campaign had been so severe that he couldn't fully replace them, and partly because the coalition was now coordinated and cautious. They avoided battle unless they had overwhelming advantage, and they could afford to do this because they had the resources, particularly Britain's financial subsidies, to sustain their armies, while Napoleon was fighting on credit and prayer. And at Leipzig in October 1813, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, and after 3 days of fighting, he was decisively defeated and forced to retreat back to France. And this defeat was catastrophic because it meant the loss of Germany, the end of the satellite kingdoms, and the collapse of French dominance in Europe. But more fundamentally, it meant Napoleon's financial model was broken. He could no longer fund France through conquest and plunder. He was now fighting defensively on French soil, and the debt problem that he'd been avoiding through military success was now unavoidable. The campaign in France in 1814 is heartbreaking in some ways, because Napoleon showed he was still a military genius, outnumbered, outresourced, fighting against multiple converging armies. He won a series of brilliant tactical victories, but they couldn't change the strategic reality. France was exhausted, the population was tired of war, Napoleon had no money to pay or supply his troops properly. Desertion was increasing, and even his own marshals, the men who'd followed him for years, were losing faith. And finally, in April 1814, faced with his marshal's refusal to continue and the Allied armies closing in on Paris, Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba, and the stated reason was military defeat. But the underlying cause was financial exhaustion. France simply couldn't continue funding Napoleon's wars. The debt had grown too large, the economy was too strained, and the system collapsed. But wait, the story isn't over, because Napoleon escaped from Elba in 1815 and returned to France for the 100 Days. And this final episode perfectly illustrates how debt spirals constrain options. Because Napoleon wanted to make peace, he claimed he'd learned his lesson, but the European powers wouldn't negotiate. They declared him an outlaw and assembled armies to destroy him. And Napoleon, needing to act before these armies converged, attacked into Belgium, hoping to defeat the British and Prussian armies separately before others arrived. And at Waterloo, he came remarkably close to winning, but ultimately he lost. And this final defeat led to exile on St. Helena and the end of his career. But here's the crucial point. Napoleon's room for maneuver in 1815 was entirely constrained by financial reality. France was broke. He couldn't raise funds for a large army or a long campaign. He had to win quickly or not at all. And this financial constraint shaped his military strategy and ultimately contributed to his defeat. Now let's step back and analyze the broader lessons, because Napoleon's debt spiral teaches us several crucial things about the relationship between finance and power. First, military genius alone isn't enough. Napoleon was arguably the greatest battlefield commander in history. He could win against overwhelming odds. He could execute maneuvers that still amaze military historians. But he couldn't overcome financial fundamentals. When you're broke, when your economy can't support your ambitions, Tactical brilliance has limits. Second, conquest is not a sustainable economic model. It can work temporarily, bringing in plunder and indemnities that fund further expansion, but eventually you run out of places to conquer. You create coalitions of enemies who pool resources against you, and the costs of occupation and suppression exceed the benefits of exploitation. Napoleon learned this the hard way. Or rather, he never really learned it. He just kept conquering until he couldn't anymore. Third, debt spirals have their own logic that constrains choices. Once you're deep enough in debt, once your economy is strained enough, you lose options. Napoleon couldn't make peace because he needed indemnities to pay debts. He couldn't reduce military spending because that would mean accepting defeat and losing everything. So he was trapped, forced to keep fighting, keep conquering, keep gambling, until he finally lost. This is true for countries, companies, and individuals. Debt creates its own necessity, and escaping requires either sustained sacrifice that Napoleon couldn't impose on France, or some external miracle that never came. Fourth, ignoring economics doesn't make economic problems go away. Napoleon seemed to believe that military success would solve everything, that if he just kept winning battles, the money would somehow work out, and for years it did. But underlying fundamentals eventually assert themselves. You can't permanently fund a state through plunder. You can't maintain military dominance without economic foundations, and pretending otherwise just postpones the reckoning. Fifth, the relationship between financial and military power is complex. Britain, Napoleon's ultimate nemesis, wasn't the strongest military power. British armies were small compared to France's, and they lost battles on land. But Britain had the financial capacity to sustain long wars, to subsidize allies, to maintain naval supremacy, and to outlast opponents. British public debt actually exceeded French debt in relative terms, but Britain had developed sophisticated financial institutions, a functioning bond market, and credibility with lenders that meant they could borrow at low rates and sustain high debt levels. France under Napoleon never achieved this financial sophistication, partly because the revolution had destroyed trust in government credit, and partly because Napoleon himself didn't prioritize or understand finance. So Britain, the financially sophisticated power, ultimately defeated France. The military genius, which tells us something important about the foundations of power. There's also a psychological dimension worth exploring, because Napoleon's blindness to financial reality seems to have been partly temperamental. He was a man of action, of decisive moves and bold gambles, and finance is about patience, about careful management, about accepting constraints and working within them. These weren't Napoleon's strengths. He wanted problems solved immediately, preferably through dramatic action. And when financial advisors told him that France needed years of peace to rebuild finances, he essentially ignored them and launched new campaigns. This mismatch between Napoleon's temperament and what financial stability required was probably unfixable. He was who he was, and his genius in some domains couldn't compensate for incompatibility with financial reality. The legacy of Napoleon's debt spiral extended far beyond his own defeat, because France emerged from the Napoleonic Wars deeply in debt, economically exhausted, and facing political instability that would persist for decades. The restored Bourbon monarchy inherited these problems. The July monarchy of 1830 dealt with them. And even the Second Empire under Napoleon's nephew Napoleon III was constrained by the financial legacy of the Napoleonic Wars, so Napoleon's failure to address France's debt problem had consequences that lasted for generations, affecting French military capacity, political stability, and economic development through much of the 19th century. And this raises a counterfactual question. What if Napoleon had prioritized financial stability? What if, after the victories of 1805 to 1807, he'd made peace, focused on internal development, and worked to retire France's debt rather than launching new conquests? France would probably have remained a dominant European power. Napoleon might have died as emperor of a stable French empire, and European history would have been completely different. But this would have required Napoleon to be someone fundamentally different, someone more like Alexios Komnenos, who understood that financial stability was the foundation of power, rather than someone who saw finance as an annoying constraint on military action. The comparison to other great military leaders is instructive. Alexander the Great conquered vast territories, but died young before financial problems could catch up to him. Julius Caesar was deeply in debt and used military success to pay creditors, similar to Napoleon. But he was assassinated before the sustainability of his model could be tested. Genghis Khan built an empire that lasted centuries partly because the Mongols developed sophisticated financial systems to sustain their conquests. As we discussed earlier, so Napoleon's failure wasn't inevitable for military geniuses, but it required either luck, like Alexander's timing, or financial sophistication that Napoleon lacked. And this reminds us that the greatest leaders combine multiple forms of intelligence: military, political, administrative, and economic, and weakness in any domain can undermine strengths in others. Looking at Napoleon's story from a modern economic perspective, we can see he was caught in what economists call a debt deflation spiral, though in his case, it was a debt war spiral, where high debt forces actions that create more debt, and the cycle accelerates until it collapses. Modern countries with high debt levels face similar dynamics. They need growth to pay debt, but debt service crowds out productive investment, slowing growth, which makes debt harder to pay, which forces austerity or inflation, which slows growth further, and escaping requires either default, inflation, sustained fiscal discipline over many years, or extremely strong growth, none of which are easy, and Napoleon had none of these options. He couldn't default on French debt without destroying internal political support. He couldn't inflate because he'd just stabilized the currency and needed it trusted for war finance. He couldn't impose sustained fiscal discipline because that required peace, which he couldn't accept, and he couldn't generate growth because he was constantly at war. So he was genuinely trapped, and his only escape attempt, conquering enough to pay everything off, was always a long shot that ultimately failed. In the end, Napoleon's debt spiral is a story about the limits of genius, about how extraordinary ability in one domain can't compensate for fundamental problems in another, about how debt creates its own logic that constrains even the most powerful leaders, and about how financial problems, if not addressed, eventually become fatal no matter how many battles you win. And it's a reminder that in analyzing historical figures, we need to look not just at their strengths and achievements, but at their blind spots and failures, and understand how these interact. Napoleon was undoubtedly a genius in military affairs, in administration, in shaping legal and political institutions, but he was financially blind, and this blindness destroyed him, not immediately, not obviously, but through a gradual spiral that constrained his options, forced increasingly desperate actions, and ultimately made defeat inevitable. And perhaps the final irony is that Napoleon's military genius, the very thing that made him dominant for so long, was what trapped him in the debt spiral, because his ability to win battles meant he could always choose one more campaign, one more conquest, one more roll of the dice, instead of accepting peace and addressing the underlying financial crisis. So his strength became his weakness, and the debt spiral that could have ended any mediocre ruler in years took 15 years to bring down Napoleon. But in the end, it brought him down just the same, because money, as it turns out, is more fundamental than genius, and financial reality eventually defeats even the greatest military mind in history.